Okay, next is figures of thought. Figures of thought, essentially, where you are doing the same thing as you do with figure of speech, but you're doing it with a concept or an idea, and you're attaching it to words. So, an artistic turning of a word or phrase from its proper meaning to another. Metaphor is the first and the most important, I should add. Metaphor transfers or substitutes one word for another. A definition of metaphor that Sharon Crowley gave. In the Poetics, she quotes Aristotle. In the Poetics, Aristotle defined metaphor as the movement of a name from its own genus or species to another genus or species. In the Rhetoric, he noted that metaphors borrowed from something greater in the same genus or species were complementary, while those borrowed from something worse could be used to denigrate the person or thing to whom it was applied. So a pirate, for example, might be called an entrepreneur, or a business person. We call a lawyer a shark sometimes, that kind of thing. That's what she's talking about there. Metaphor is implied comparison between things of unlike nature. Metaphor enables us to see things in new ways, and that's the value of metaphor when it's used well. Spurgeon said a child of God should be a visible beatitude for joy and happiness, and a living doxology for gratitude and adoration. It's interesting. If you want to picture the abstract, the immaterial, picture it with something material. If you want to picture the material, picture it as something immaterial. That's one strategy for metaphor. It doesn't work all the time, but often you are, the poet said, your love is like a red, red rose. That kind of thing is metaphor. Let's see. I think I have. Do I have some examples? Okay, we'll skip that. Simile is next. Simile is a kind of metaphor. The difference is that you use the word like. So we say that Satan goes about as a roaring lion. That's simile. All right? If we said that the devil is a devouring wolf, that would be metaphor. So there's the difference. Simile, you're making it more apparent that you are that you're using comparison. It is comparison of one object with another. And you have an example from the Iliad. The Trojans had gathered around Ulysses like ravenous mountain jackals around the carcass of some stag that has been hit with an arrow. All right, allegory is next. Allegory is an extended metaphor. So, for example, the Pilgrim's Progress is an allegory of the Christian's walk. And essentially, Christian is a metaphor for all of us, and the things he experiences and sees are designed to picture the Christian walk in life. We don't actually walk on a trail. We do not actually walk through the Slough of Despond. We do not actually visit the Wicket Gate. We do not actually go to the Celestial City. We don't ever visit Doubting Castle or see the Giant Despair. We don't find ourselves on the Delectable Mountains or in the home of Mr. Interpreter or any of those things. We don't actually physically cross the Jordan. All the things that John Bunyan used in his Pilgrim's Progress are all metaphors. So the story itself is an allegory. That's the idea. In an allegory, you are comparing a relationship rather than comparing items. A metaphor, someone said, becomes an allegory when it is sustained throughout a long passage. So the examples that we have here in Ezekiel, I will therefore spread my net over you with a company of many people, and they will draw you up in my net. Then I will leave you on the land. I will cast you out on the open fields and cause to settle on you all the birds of heaven. Paul used the allegory in Galatians 4, you'll remember, between Hagar and Sarah. And Hagar, he said, is Mount Sinai. And Sarah is Jerusalem, Mount Zion. And he said, Sinai tends to bondage, just as the bondwoman and her son were cast out. So the Apostle Paul is using what happened when Abraham, under Sarah's, or because of Sarah's insistence, drove Hagar out into the wilderness. And Paul is comparing that to the way the law, the Old Testament law, the ceremonial law, was brought to an end, was driven out. And Jerusalem that is above is free, being the mother of us all. So that's allegory. Next is synecdoche. Synecdoche, the word literally means to receive together. To receive together. Synecdoche, we substitute the part for the whole, or vice versa, the whole for the part. Or we substitute cause for effect. Sharon Crowley gives several examples. The Roman won the day. Didn't just win the day, but essentially we understand that to mean that he won the battle. And the Roman refers to the entire army. The author of the Adoranium gave this example. Were not those nuptial flutes reminding you of his marriage? Of course, the flutes stand for the whole ceremony. So, synecdoche, give us this day our daily bread. Of course, bread stands for the meal. Was this the faith that launched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless towers of Ilium? The face, of course, is speaking, the poem, it's Christopher Marlowe's poem about Helen of Troy, and Helen's legendary beauty. And the story, what started those great wars, was the kidnapping, and it's debated whether he was kidnapped or not. Pardon me. The story is that either Helen ran off or Helen was kidnapped. Either way, there was a great war fought over it. Helen was legendary for her beauty, Helen of Troy, and so the face is speaking of Helen, the person. It's similar to what we do when we say, give me a hand. When you say, give me a hand, or let's give a big hand for this, we're not asking for the person's hand. We're not asking for a big hand, like whoever has a big hand, raise your hand. Apparently Donald Trump wouldn't qualify because he has tiny hands. But either way, that's not what we're saying. When a young man asks a young lady's father, may I have her hand in marriage, requests her hand in marriage, he's not just asking for her hand, he's asking for her. But the hand stands for her in this case, so that's synecdoche. Next is metonymy. Metonymy is, literally, metonymy means altered name. It names something with a word or phrase closely associated with it. For example, if you're watching the news tonight and they announced that the White House today announced that they intend to invade Iraq, you know that the White House wasn't doing the speaking. But the White House has become synonymous with the president. We say this came from the Oval Office. We mean it came from the president's office, so it speaks of him. That's metonymy. Someone said the pen is mightier than the sword. Well, the pen there has no power, neither does the sword. But the pen, what's being said is that the words are more powerful than physical brute strength. That's metonymy. Churchill's "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." Um, and of course, the Bible in Psalm 78 says he gave also their increase unto the caterpillar and their labor unto the locust. Next is periphrasis. Periphrasis. Now, you notice you have a paraphrase. You also have parentheses. Periphrasis is literally circling speech. Also known as circumlocution. Periphrasis talks around something for the sake of discretion, perhaps, sometimes out of cowardice, but for whatever reason, you're talking around something. You don't want to say it directly. It is a substitution of a descriptive word or phrase for a proper name, or of a proper name for a quality associated with that name. Quintilian said whatever might have been expressed with greater brevity, but is expanded for purpose of ornament. Okay, so instead of saying that, what's her name? I can't remember. If I just throw out Ginger Rogers or some famous blonde movie star, the one escapes me, Grace Kelly. Instead, the blonde bombshell stars with Cary Grant. Let me give you an example here. Virgil saying that night arrived. Now was the time when the first sleep to weary mortals comes, stealing its way, the sweetest boon of heaven. That's a poetic way of saying they fell asleep. Sometimes people are tempted, especially college students who are trying to fill a certain word count, are tempted to use periphrasis as a filler. Quintilian said some writers introduce a whole host of useless words, for in their eagerness to avoid ordinary methods of expression and allured by false ideals of beauty, they wrap up everything in a multitude of words simply and solely because they are unwilling to make a direct and simple statement of the facts. So, and this, by the way, is the two-edged sword of ornament and figures of speech and thought. You want to use these, but you want to use them well. You want to use it artistically. It should not be evident that you're trying to be fancy in the way that you speak. Let's see if I can find some other examples here. Let's see. The history of Western psychological thought has long been dominated by philosophical considerations as to the nature of man. These notions have dictated corresponding considerations of the nature of the child within society, the practices by which children were to be raised, and the purposes of studying the child. This is an example of the official style. Probably not a good example here for what we're trying to do. All right, let's move on then to hyperbole. Hyperbole is also known as overstatement. The word means thrown above, or it refers to excess. It's an excessive way of saying something, an excessive way, not just elaborate, but excessive. An elegant straining of the truth, Quintilian called it, exaggeration for the purpose of heightening the effect. You see what James Dobson said about 200 active 2-year-olds. That's a strain at reality. But it's said for effect. That's why people say, man, it took me forever to do that. And my wife, who can't ever just say that I had to clean up billions of pieces of trash. She has to say something else. Bazillions is her word. Bazillions is not a word, as I like to remind her. But nonetheless, it has that effect of hyperbole. Antinoclassis literally means bending back. It is a figure of repetition, a means of calling attention to words and ideas that are important. It is a repetition of a word in two different senses. Okay, that's antinoclassis. Ben Franklin liked to use this one, and you see a couple of great examples. Your argument is sound, he said, nothing but sound. Now that's a quick switch there. And the first sound is a setup. We must all hang together, he said, or assuredly we will all hang separately. Now the hanging together, of course, is like the way teenagers hang out. And the second time is hanging by the neck till dead. But I don't have to explain that to you. Litotes literally understatement. Deliberate use of understatement, usually stated as a double negative. I will not forget, we say. Or I will not misremember. I will not fail to forget you. A citizen of no mean city, the Apostle Paul said. So in other words, he was a citizen of Tarsus, and Tarsus was, in fact, a great city. In fact, there was a certain level of education and a certain level of income that was required in order to live in Tarsus. So the Apostle Paul belonged to a very wealthy family, and we can gather that from his use of litotes. Litotes essentially is used to diminish the feature of the situation that's obvious to everybody. So it's a way of stating the obvious without stating the obvious. It allows the reader to avoid stating the exact extent of the thing understated. And essentially what it does for you, sorry to use the word essentially so much, but it emphasizes the author's tact. It shows you to be a tactful person in how you say it. So when Paul said that he was a citizen of no mean city, he was trying not to boast. Oxymoron is the next. It is a connection of ordinarily contradictory terms, like, for example, Marine Corps intelligence, cold heat, eloquent silence, clearly opaque, and you hath he quickened who are dead in trespasses and sin. And feminist, which is oxymoronic. Personification is the next. Personification involves investing abstractions or inanimate objects with human qualities. Love moved her to pick up the sword and fight. Doth not wisdom cry? Proud liberty weeps for us. It allows us to display our inner thoughts as though they were present in the moment. It gives life and vitality to what we are saying. Personification. Earth felt the wound, and nature from her seat, sighing through all her works, gave signs of woe. That's another example of personification. You're energizing a scene. You're taking an idea, a concept, and giving it life. Irony is next. It's a favorite of mine, at least. It involves the use of a word or phrase in such a way as to convey a meaning opposite of the literal meaning. It occurs when an audience understands the opposite of what is expressed. Oh yeah, I want to eat those Brussels sprouts. Please give me a plateful, he says. Nice day, huh? When it's a really lousy day outside. That kind of thing. Break the chain of violence, which is an ironic statement. It was not intended to be ironic. It just is. The only way to break a chain is with violence. And so you're essentially break the chain of violence was used to urge parents not to use any physical means of discipline or chastisement on their children. Break the chain of violence, they said. And so we like to quip that when we spank our children, because, for instance, my daughter clubbed my son upside the head and stole his toy, I'm breaking the chain of violence. Cicero, we gallant men that we are, think that we are doing our duty to the Republic if we keep out of the way of his frenzied attacks. So he's using irony there. Next is interrogation. It's essentially the rhetorical question. The Apostle Paul used it. What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid, he said. He answers his own question. But the rhetorical question is a question that essentially does not need to be answered. Dubitatio is pretending that you don't know what to say here. Pretending that you're stuck with this. And he says that I'm a bum. That's the idea behind that. What, have ye not houses to eat and to drink in? So he's feigning, he's pretending, he's not, but he's feigning outrage. He is outraged. He really is. So he's showing it in the way that he says it by pretending, kind of like a hyperbole, extending it to the extreme in order to emphasize the outrage that I'm feeling right now. Apostrophe is kind of similar to that parentheses again, but you're in front of your audience, you're pretending to speak directly to a person and speak in a private kind of way. Paul crying out, O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? Paralipsis is that figure of speech that we've spoken about before, where I say, I'm not the one to speak to you about this, and then I speak to you about it anyway. I'm not even going to begin to speak of all the outrages that have been committed in this case. My opponent has abused your sensibility, has abused your integrity, and so on. Now, I said I was going to speak about it, and then I spoke about it. That's paralipsis. Aporia is the last one. Talking about not being able to talk about something. Arthur Quinn said to talk about not being able to talk or decide about something is an aporia, and I don't have words to tell you how often it's used. Okay? So I don't have the words to describe this. Tongue cannot tell. Those are the figures of thought, and we've talked through these things now.